let's go ahead and advance through our slides, Zeta. Okay, so if you're new to I4CP, we're a human capital research firm and we're dedicated to uncovering the people practices that drive high performance. So what does that mean? Well, we define high performance companies in our research as those that really excel in four key areas: revenue growth, market share, profitability, and customer satisfaction. And so the focus of our research is looking at what it is that high performance companies do that really differentiate them. What are they doing differently? And so that question that as researchers we continually ask of one another and of the data is, what are the practices that we're seeing that really distinguish high performing companies from the rest of the pack? We also look to identify what we call at I4CP next practices in our research, and those we define as strategies that our data analysis shows correlates to better performance, but that are not yet widely in implementation in most organizations. So it's a glimpse of what we're seeing is on the horizon and something really worth paying attention to. So before we get rolling, we want to first welcome our global community of I4CP members, some of whom you see represented on this slide. This is not a complete list of all of our members. But our members are really the fuel that drives the engine of all of our research, and we couldn't do any of it without our member community. And speaking of our member community, I4CP, if you're not familiar with us, we are a member organization, meaning that all of our research is driven and informed by the leadership of the companies you see here on this slide, and there are many more in addition to the logos you see here. Our work is independent. We call it pure research, which means it's not sponsored or underwritten by vendors or consultants. Our research is wholly independent and done on behalf of our global membership community. And if you want more information about I4CP, feel free to reach out to me or any of my colleagues on the call today, Zeta or Mimi, and I believe we have some of our other colleagues on the call as well. Okay, so hi, my name is Lorrie Lykins. I'm the VP of Research here at I4CP. I also support our talent acquisition board members. So these are the senior most executives in the companies that are represented on that board in the talent acquisition space. I'm joined today by two of my favorite colleagues, Zeta Timmerman, who keeps us on track during these calls. I call her our air traffic controller, and Mimi Turner, who's I4CP's Vice President of Executive Search. So as we often do, we want to get started with this conversation today by launching a poll. And while you respond to this poll, I'll go ahead and tell you a little bit more about Mimi. So Mimi Turner, as I said, she leads I4CP's Executive Search practice, which is focused on innovating in search engagements that stem from strong and diverse talent pipelines and deep relationships with both our clients and our candidates. Mimi has a career that spans more than 20 years, and she's got a really unique blend of skills and very deep expertise in talent marketing, operations, and analytics, all of which she uses to build a very solid track record of success in talent leadership. Also strategic partnerships, which we all know are critically important in terms of success with talent acquisition, building and growing successful teams, and so much more. Mimi earned her bachelor's degree from the Haas School of Business at UC Berkeley and her master's from the Presidio Graduate School. And she is based in the San Francisco Bay Area. So hi, Mimi, please say hello.
Hello, everyone. Delighted to join you all this morning.
Okay, so we're seeing in our poll, which we're asking, if you're not able to have a view of the screen, is we're asking whether or not those of you who are on the call today have had a layoff in your organization in the last 90 days. So it looks like about a third are saying yes, the majority, 63%, are saying no, and then we've got 6% saying not yet, but there's some anticipation that maybe this might be happening. So we'll get into a discussion about layoffs and what's happening with all of that in a little while. And this is something that we want to remind all of you of, is that we just released our first major study of the year, Culture Fitness. And many of the topics we touch on today are definitely related to culture. But I also just wanted to point out that we will be hosting a webinar on this study and all of the really interesting data that's in it February 16th. And I was just going to say, Zeta's going to share some links to that. Okay. All right. So Mimi, let's talk about all the things related to talent acquisition. Starting with just touching base with our priorities and predictions study that we did, and this also was published recently, and it's available to the public. I4CP runs 6 boards, and we survey these boards every year, usually the 3rd or 4th quarter of the preceding year, and ask, hey, what are your major priorities for the coming year? What's keeping you up at night? What are you going to be focusing on? The Talent Acquisition Board laid out 4 really solid priorities, but what I really want to focus on here is the second one, number 2, enhancing the organization's workforce planning capabilities. And we could take this conversation in a lot of directions, but for the time we have today, I want to launch from this and talk a little bit about internal talent mobility as a critically important element of workforce planning, which always starts with really having an understanding of who do we have, what skills do we have in the company, do we have who and what we need now, and what about who and what we're going to need in the future. And we're going to do a second poll before we start talking about this. And we really want to know, does your organization have an internal talent mobility function, and is it going well? And if you don't, and you know of someone else who does, please let us know about that too. So Mimi, top of mind thoughts about internal talent mobility for you.
Ooh, top of mind. There's a lot of stuff going on in this head of mine, but I'm looking around the room, and many of you already know the value of internal mobility. Right? I was a proud product of internal mobility, where I was in 3 different roles across, 8 years, starting in the business and transitioning into 2 HR roles in an organization, a member organization, into it. Right? I was also part of a global organization at Equinix, also, former members, that supported global mobility across many country borders. Right. And I'm looking at y'all, and I know there are many benefits to leveraging these already known top tier performers across your firms and organizations. And the learning curves are less steep, right? Because the folks know the company, possess the institutional knowledge, and have the partnership, Lorrie, like you mentioned earlier, right? To quickly accelerate from day one. Right. But internal mobility is also a way to keep your employees engaged and retention high.
And this is a strategy that I'm really curious about, and we've talked about this a little bit amongst our research team. With seeing all of these layoffs that have been happening the last couple of months, whether or not there was a lot of time spent in conversation and really looking deeply at your own data and your own workforce in terms of, do we really need to lay these folks off, or are there opportunities to move them into other parts of the organization, into other functional areas? But that starts with really knowing who and what you have.
Yep. Absolutely.
Go ahead. Go ahead, Nina.
Oh, yeah, I was going to say absolutely, right? It's, it's thinking about kind of, that internal talent sourcing is, that business and understanding on both sides, what skills and capabilities do folks possess, and where do you keep that?
Right. So we've got a question from Jacob, who's asking you, Mimi, curious if you see a common time in role that seems to be healthier for top performing companies. This is an interesting topic because I know some companies have really rigid rules around, you can't even think about considering an internal move unless you've been here for X amount of time. And we know one strategy that's been discussed in the context of the Talent Acquisition Board is just either drastically reducing those time constraints or just doing away with them altogether. What's your response to Jacob's question?
Jacob, great question. And is it every two to 3 years? Is it every year and a half? Is it every 5 years? The answer to that is it depends on the organization, right? It depends on the maturity of the organization. It depends on what resources and structures and frameworks does the organization have to support that mobility, right? Because I have seen mobility in startups like from 3 months to 6 months, right? You
Right.
jump in, you help a team out and you're like, oh, that team sees that you're amazing. You move to the next one, right? But then in, the larger organizations where the initiatives and projects are bigger, right? Transformative and things like that, it might be, 2 to 3 years, but it really comes down to working in partnership with your HR teams to figure out what does the learning and development look like in certain roles, right? What
Right.
does an understanding and mastery of the skills and capabilities of a certain role look like before you have somebody move in. I am a huge fan of matrices and rubrics that allow people to kind of find out like, oh, I am here on this role. Okay, this is what it means. And when am I ready to move to the next one?
Got it. So I really appreciate all of the comments. Kelly, thank you for being so candid. Dawn, also, we're tracking it, but we're not, doing a spectacular job of it, at least not yet. Thanks for being candid about that, because I think often there's this assumption that everybody else is way further down the road than we are. We've kind of missed the boat. We haven't even gotten started, and that's just not always the case. We expect folks to stay enrolled at least a year before they're eligible for upward movement. So Kathleen, my question would be, is it the same 1 year time frame for lateral movement?
We've been, as we have considered this, the truth is to stabilize our workforce, depending on, the type of economy we've been in, right? We really were looking to hold the line on having people stay in a role for a year. For, pretty much any movement with the caveat that there are, of course, exceptions, right? And the reason why we did it that way is because we have in the organization that we just came from, we had a very, I'll call it youthful workforce whose expectation was to get promoted, on a consistent basis, basically looking to be promoted every 6 months, and the managers were not doing a great job of, career development, if you will. So we had to set some rules, right, in order to at least have parameters to work from. That's one environment, and that was in an environment where we were trying to stabilize the workforce, right, and get people to settle into their roles and get momentum around the work before we started doing a lot of movement. So that was one environment. The environment I'm in now, it just isn't an issue. We don't get pushed on it all the time, right? It's just not the culture that everybody's pushing on promotions every 6 months. So it isn't really, hasn't really come up. In the other environment, it was a constant. It was just like people lined up at my door saying, I have a promotion I want to bring to your attention. I want to have a promotion. And it just got to be out of control. But the root cause, in my estimation, was that managers weren't doing a great job in career development and growing and developing people in place, or having them feel like they are growing and developing in place. And the other thing is, I think the other root cause for that issue was the fact that we weren't doing merit-based raises. We were doing flat raises, which people thought were more like cost of living raises. So we weren't recognizing people for performance. So the only way they saw as being recognized for performance was promotion. And that's not a good way to do it. So
Got it.
long answer,
Yeah.
but that's how I see it.
Thanks, Kathleen. Well, speaking of the role of the manager, our research has definitely shown, and it's shown over and over again, that high performing organizations definitely hold managers accountable for developing their people and moving their people. So, rewarding and incentivizing managers as developers of talent, really, really important. Definitely practice of high performance organizations. Helps to address that talent hoarding tendency for sure. Let me see, there's a couple other really great comments. Yes, onboarding costs definitely lower when you have internal hires. There's also the cultural implications, right? First of all, we don't want the high performing talent, the high potential talent to feel like they have to leave the organization to get the skills and experiences that they need to continue their career trajectory. So yes, the internal hiring, there are so many benefits to not only the employees, the individuals, the teams, but also the overall culture and the employer brand of the organization.
And Lori, to Don's note here, about talent hoarders, right? I think the way you got to look at it is, it's not your talent or my talent, it's our talent as an organization. Because if we're not thinking that way, another company's going to swoop in, right?
Right.
Because here we are not sharing among each other, right? And we're going to turn around and somebody else is going to be taking the talent. So the way I have seen it in organizations in my past is, as managers, we have goals around how we move talent and how we support talent within the organization.
Right. It's funny. I remember several years ago, this is well before the pandemic, but being at a conference, there were some technology vendors there, and they were talking about their technology in terms of this, internal talent mobility technology, career development technology is really going to help companies address the talent hoarding manager problem. It really gets, your talent out from under having to get permission from their managers. And I just thought, wow, just from a cultural perspective, again, about organizations, that was just such an interesting angle to take when talking about it. Thank you for all of the great comments. Okay, so let's move on. I think we have, on the next slide, Zeta, I think that we do have, yes, some information from our skills databases, research that we did recently that was led by our colleague, Tom Stone. What we found was that, as I mentioned earlier, most organizations really don't have a clear picture of who and what they have in their organizations. So lack of confidence in the current state of the workforce, not surprising given the fact that, organizations are not confident that they know who and what they have. But creating a skills database, even if you're starting that work with an Excel spreadsheet, critically important to being able to build an infrastructure that enables internal talent mobility for sure. And as you can see, we labeled it as next practice because it correlates to higher market performance, but not a whole lot of organizations are doing it yet. So if you're in this group, don't feel badly about it. You're not alone. And then I think our next slide also continues a little bit more on your skills databases. Yep. So not knowing is really a huge barrier in terms of doing what you may be wanting to do in 2023 in terms of renovating your organization's ability to retain and develop your talent, move them around the organization, really understand who you have, who needs to be upskilled, reskilled, all of those things. Okay, so we also wanted to talk about reductions in force and what is happening with reductions in force. And I know this is a topic that's on all of our minds, especially with everything that's been happening the last couple of months with layoffs that have not been handled well, really sort of some callous indifference that we've seen in some of the ways that these layoffs have been handled. And I know, Mimi, you've got your own experience in managing layoffs and a lot of insight in terms of what it's like to be the person doing the layoffs as well as being laid off.
And Lori, I've unfortunately been at big enterprises, startups where there were reductions in force. And it's never ideal to be on either side, to be laid off or the one informing those impacted.
Right.
And I'll share with you, there is real PTSD on both sides, right? And from what I've seen lately, I think that some folks and companies have lost the human dimension and forgotten that although these reductions decisions are business decisions, right? They have real human impact. And that in doing so, let's not forget the empathy and the compassion for people, right? So this is, another reason why I'm such a big supporter of the TA community coming together, especially, those on this call, to help each other rebuild, given that the hit that, our function has taken.
Right.
Many of you are already doing this. You're taking, so I think the extra call for me is just reminding everybody to take the time to make the connection and introduce a job seeker to a hiring manager. Right? Review that resume and give that much needed feedback. Okay? And coach someone through their next interview or job offer. We will come back stronger as we help lift each other up.
What do you think about the impact of these badly handled layoffs in terms of the long-term effects for organizations, their employer brand? Because, I was speaking with an employment lawyer earlier this week who's an expert on non-compete agreements. We're having a conversation about the proposed non-compete ban that the FTC has put forward. And one of the things that he said is clearly there's a lot of reactive layoffs going on, but what we're also seeing is long-term damage in terms of companies being viewed as employers of choice down the road, and not only by the people who are being laid off in a callous or indifferent way or perceived to be that way, but it's their friends, their family members, their professional networks, that this reactive decision to lay off and just do it really quickly without, it appears to be without a whole lot of planning. Let's just rip the Band-Aid off and get it done quickly and move on. That the ramifications of that are going to be long-term for those organizations.
And you are right. The ramifications, the implications downstream, right? I think, Lori, you had mentioned Dr. Beverly, who talked about, make it, graceful so folks can return. Right. And, think about, how do you attract not only the boomerangs, but the people to your company after the news is out there. And when you talk about news, we all know, right? There are social media, there are, social network sites out there that folks can just post, right? And candidates do a lot of research before they join an organization. So the damage not only remains to, your brand and how you attract, but then there's also those that still remain in your organization.
Right.
How are they feeling about where they are, and are they questioning, if it's the right place for them anymore?
So, and this is something that came up with some of the research that we did a couple of months ago when there was a huge increase in unionization activity. We're seeing labor disputes going on right now that are very public. I just read last night that, staff members at MSNBC and NBC are threatening to walk out because of, issues with their labor agreements. And then we saw Disney yesterday is laying off 7,000 people worldwide. When we looked at the things that people had in common who were leading some of this unionization activity a couple of months ago, it was pretty much the same thing no matter who their employer was. It's pretty much the same script. We gave our all to these companies the past 3 years. We poured everything we had into them during the pandemic. And now that things are starting to recede, we feel like we're not being treated respectfully, with care and consideration. There's a breaking of trust. And then the effects of that, to your point, survivor's guilt for the people who, survived the layoff. Lack of trust in managers, conflict within teams. So what can managers and leaders do, especially to help put things back together in organizations that have experienced a layoff or are about to.
I love this. So Lori, I'm reading Tracy's note here, right? Sessions with those not impacted and provided information, why people were impacted, and their CEO also was very involved. Love to, ask those on the call, like, what other things are you seeing that is done well? And Kelly, I know it's not only about the organizations, but individual managers that are helping folks out.
All clear message at the end of layoffs. That's a good one, Kathleen, because people are, coming to work feeling like there's an anvil dangling over their head. And when is that going to drop? Right. The other thing is, I think that just based on conversations I've had the last 2 weeks, there's a hesitancy to call people to account when there is, so stress and anxiety leads to some behaviors in the workplace that aren't productive, right? But a hesitancy on the part of managers to address that. So acknowledging what has happened is really important, but I'm surprised to hear that there's a lot of conflict avoidance. It's really important to call that out, to work through it, to model healthy behavior, which means having candid, open conversations about all of this, creating a safe space. We talk a lot about, psychological safety. It's really important to acknowledge that this has happened. And to your point, Kathleen, the all clear, let's all settle down. Let's talk about what's happened. And yeah, it makes sense that you're going to be better equipped to move forward as a team and as an organization if you're having those conversations in real time rather than avoiding it because it's uncomfortable or awkward.
Lori, I'm also looking at Kathy note about personalized script to impacted employees, right? When an organization can sit down and speak with these employees and have a conversation with them, that creates an incredible experience that remains with that employee, right?
Right.
As they look back, about that conversation. But I think, what if you're in an organization where coordinating that at scale cannot be done one-to-one, right? So we're hearing some of these organizations out there are sending emails, right?
Right.
What happens there?
Talking points for leaders delivery messaging. Yep. I think that's a really great point, Cassie, especially because consistency in the messaging that's being shared with employees is really important because employees talk with one another, they share notes. So it's really important that they're not hearing different messages from different leaders depending on whom they're talking to. Really strengthening or reminding everyone about the EAP assistance that's available to them. We talked a lot about this during the pandemic, that organizations were enhancing their investment in EAP offerings, but also really making a point to remind employees that these benefits are available to you. Mimi, one of the things that you mentioned to me the other day that I thought was really fascinating is the total rewards implications of all of this. And you mentioned hiring principles and how important it is for organizations to have those. Would you mind sharing a little bit with everybody on the call today what you mean by that, what that looks like?
Sure. And maybe I'll give everybody just a little bit of the background because they weren't in the conversation with us, Lori.
Right.
So it's been a decade and a half since many of us that have been in TA in a long time have seen a downturn like this. Some would say that the run up was due to companies, unleashing an all out war for talent. Right, which meant companies one-upping each other, auction style for talent, right? Highest bidder wins. I have seen this like in front of my own two eyes, right? But this also has huge implications. Probably another reason why we've seen these reductions in force. It's such, big scales, right? So this is a reminder for us, at this time in TA to establish our principles when it comes to offers, hiring, total rewards, right? And to trust them and stay consistent, right? I agree. You can have exceptions, right? But understand and agree when you are going to use them, right? And revisit your principles when you're finding that the exceptions end up being the norm, right? But these principles then anchor your TA, your total rewards, and your HR partners together as you are bringing in great talent to your organizations.
Thanks, Mimi. I'm trying to get through these comments. Thank you so much, everybody, for your engagement. Okay. What is the role of the HR business partners in HR and workforce planning?
Ooh, I love that one. Where is it?
I
So,
love that one too. That
yeah.
Cecilia is asking that question. Cecilia, is this something that you're working on right now? Are you doing some work around the role of the HR business partner in general, or are you doing work on workforce planning, or both at the same time? And if you're not able to come off mute, that is fine.
While we're waiting for an answer from her, I do love the question because I remember when all of this started happening, I saw an executive in workforce planning and people analytics post on LinkedIn, essentially an apology to the talent that was being cut. And
Oh my
the
gosh.
irony of that wasn't lost on me. And it really did drive the question, what was your role in this happening? Because in an ideal world, the right amount of people analytics and strategic workforce planning would have prevented a good amount of the layoffs that have hit the market recently.
Well, and it's a great point, Jacob, and I know Twitter is an extreme case in point, but oh, oops, we inadvertently let go of talent that we really need. Would you mind coming on back? It's kind of a cringy moment.
Yeah. And I think, like the term, Lorrie, planning, right? Workforce planning. This means it shouldn't be a knee-jerk reaction. It shouldn't be a whoopsie, right? It shouldn't be, hey, we were over our skis, look, and we got to, course correct now. Workforce planning is a concept where I sit down and I look at what I often call the four-legged stool, right? Because in the world that we live in, talent acquisition, if we don't have this four-legged stool and we have a three-legged stool, it becomes a little wobbly. So I'll share a little bit about the four-legged stool. I have a lot of analogies in my world. So here's another one for y'all. It starts with a partnership with TA being one of the legs, HR BPs, right? Your finance organization, as well as the business. So all four of those groups coming together and planning, whether you're doing it on a quarterly basis, a monthly basis with check-ins and forecasts and things like that. But all four of those parties need to come together in order to make informed decision about your workforce, right? And of course, it's supported through, workforce analytics and things like that with data and insights. But having all four of those parties together helps organizations make great decisions.
And one of our colleagues, Patrick Murray, actually wrote a paper. It's on our website for our members that really lays out the four different levels of HR business partners, from more administrative to very strategic. So it's HR business partners from level 1 to level 4. It's a really great article, but really speaks to the continuously evolving role of the HR business partner and their value to the business, for sure. So employer branding. We talk about employer branding at I4CP in the simplest terms of being, it's the truth about your organization. It's the truth about what it feels like to come to work at your company every day. That's really your employer brand. And companies can do a lot to certainly influence their employer brand, But at the end of the day, the truth about what it's like to work at your company is out there in the world. Um, so looking at the impact of what is happening lately, all the challenges that organizations are experiencing at the moment, and how that affects your brand is really important. It's sometimes kind of painful to go out on sites like Glassdoor. I really like Comparably. Comparably is a really great platform. It's really interesting um, how that one operates, but really having a clear understanding of what the story is out there about your organization is critically important. And identifying how your organization's culture is perceived out there in the world beyond the total rewards that you offer, beyond salary and benefits. What are the stories out there? And I know, Mimi, you're a big proponent of storytelling and getting your story out there. This is a really big challenge for talent acquisition right now, especially for companies that have had rifts or know that rifts are coming. How do you tell the story about how great it is to come work at your organization when this is happening almost, concurrently?
I think the best way for me to say this is transparently, right? This
Mhm.
is something that, I've coached my prior TA teams about as well, right? It is a fact, right? The impact has happened. So it's not like you can go back there and sweep it under the rug and say, oh, no, it's not there, right?
Right.
I think the best thing that you can do is ensure that when you are having those conversations with candidates, you are talking about the salient points of why, right? Why was there a reduction in force? So that the candidate can understand, oh, okay, so we had to do those, take those actions in order to now be in this position. Now being in this position, the company believes that there's going to be growth or, whatever it might be. It's having that transparent discussion with candidates that allow candidates a window into your organization. Right.
Great. So speaking of that, let's talk a little bit about candidate experience. If you were coaching talent acquisition leaders right now today, which is really what this conversation is in effect, Mimi, some fabulous coaching from you. What do you think TA should focus the most energy on? I know we hear a lot about misalignment of the expectations, that candidates come in with certain expectations and a certain idea of what their role is going to be like in the organization. And then they actually, show up for work the first day and it's really not what they expected. Um, how do we address that? How do we safeguard against that?
I think so. I'll first say to this community, we have gotten so good at assessments, interviewer trainings, use of rubrics, scorecards, debriefs, and things like that. But I think if I could take a step back and think about 3 areas where I would encourage us to do better. And this is where I also welcome everybody to share your thoughts in the chat as well. There's 3 areas that I consistently see organizations kind of have an opportunity. The first one would be nail the job description, right?
Yes.
There are a lot of starts and stops, including comp issues at offer stage because of the misalignment of the role expectations, right? This is where I remind teams, like, go slow to go fast. Like, sit down, write that job description, and also make it great so that whoever it is on the other side is reading it says, yes, I want to come, I want to come work for this organization. And yes, I want to do this job. The second area that I would say is get back to people, right? In this day and age,
Yes.
with email, text, phone, heck, automation, right? We've been talking about this. There is no reason why a candidate should not receive closure, right? Sure, candidates are sitting there ghosting us, a lot,
Right.
but use the golden rule here, right? And then I think the third area that I'm super passionate about when it comes to candidate experiences, and here's my analogy for y'all, mind the gap, right? And this is something where I talk about where there still exists, this deep valley between recruiting, right, TA and onboarding. Right? And I'm beginning to see more and more that organizations are purposely bridging TA and learning and development and onboarding by blending such roles, right, under leaders, or just standing up like onboarding teams. Right. So those would be my three kind of areas where I would say, these are opportunities for us in the TA world to create that better candidate experience.
Yep. Stop ghosting candidates. Seriously. It's crazy. The simplest things seem to be the most difficult for some organizations, but they mean so much. Cassie, I love this one. Would be curious to hear from others on who leads the development of JDs. Okay. This is something we talked a lot about during the pandemic, especially at the point in the pandemic where things came to a screeching halt in some organizations. It was used as an opportunity to revisit job descriptions, especially ones that had just been sort of static for years and had not been revisited. And I've heard these conversations talked about almost in terms of a calibration session, having a very open discussion on who, first of all, who is currently really successful in this role or in a role like this. Do they really have to meet all of these criteria, all of these lists that go on forever of qualifications? How real is that? And, why are we so rigid about sticking to these JDs that have been written in stone forever? I know that's a big one. What, Mimi, you're smiling. That sound familiar?
I'm smiling because sometimes it's because legal wants us to cover.
Right.
Yeah.
And the other question that I want to ask is getting our story straight about the work model in our job descriptions. This is something I hear about a lot. I have a daughter who's very early in career in her 20s, and I get a lot of great feedback from her about what she and her peers experience in the workplace. But one of them is, don't say this is a flexible job or a hybrid opportunity if I get in there and find out my manager is not okay with hybrid, not okay with remote. And I think that there's also this issue of organizations being hesitant to really, really make whatever their policy is around work models, concrete. We're still kind of like trying to figure it out, but having remote or hybrid in the job description is really important to some segments of the talent pool out there. They're not even going to bother to go further and investigate the opportunity if they don't see from the very top that there's flexibility available. So I just think this is something we're going to be talking about for a long time, but it's just a hot topic of conversation. So I'd love to hear any thoughts anybody has about that. Dawn is saying that JDs are managed by comp in her organization. Okay. And the postings themselves are managed by recruiting. So does that mean that the recruiters who are posting these listings are able to finesse them or no? Did somebody have a question or a comment?
This is Dawn. I'm just saying that the compensation and the recruiting department sit next to each other, so they collaborate, but they also know that the audience intention are extremely different. Yeah. Like, we don't try to use a job description in any way, shape, or form to post, because clearly it's not very attractive looking. But our compensation department still highly relies on those JDs, simply because that's how they plug in their data for, their Mercer or Hay or whatever tool they're using for market comparison.
Right.
So, Dawn, how much latitude do your recruiters have in editing those job descriptions?
A lot. Because our CRM targets certain markets and targets certain demographics. And so we know that we need to make sure that the postings have the wording that is attractive and interesting to that particular demographic demographic or particular job. So like for instance, we have a reach out to military. And so our military postings, use a lot more military jargon to help those that are exiting the military to make that transition and understanding, what that job, how that job is related to them in, government sector versus private sector. The only thing I say is consistent is obviously our competencies. That goes without saying, because that's the core of, the fit to work for us.
I love that add-on, Dawn, because that was the question I was going to follow up with is, but how do you bring consistency, across the organization of like this level, this role? So I love hearing that, Dawn.
Yeah, competencies are like, is doesn't get touched. That's the only thing I want to say is the true copy and paste. Everything else gets edited for the audience. Which, by the way, in your recruiting department, that is a very important skill set that many people don't consider, because in today's market, your recruiting people, need to know much more than just how to recruit, but how they need marketing and communications expertise, given the the complexity of if you're using a CRM and you're building different types of careers profiles to reach out to different types of communities.
Right. Yep. Great point, Dawn. Thank you so much. And Kelly and Jessica, sort of follow on comments. Tailoring the job description to the audience. Mostly I hear about applicants tailoring, oops, that went down, popped down. Tailoring their resume for the position, right? And we've all seen those suggestions that you do the whole white background that has all the keywords in it. Not such a great idea. I would love to hear more about how you are modifying the descriptions to recruit more veterans. Would love to hear about that, especially from companies that have military hiring initiatives that are really highly specialized. That's great feedback, Tracy.
Yeah, maybe I can help answer that a little bit. I do, in my recruiting department, I have a military recruiting program manager who is ex-military. So he's responsible for ensuring that the I want to say our everyday postings, we don't, it's not a unique posting for a military only person, but he takes all of our postings and kind of make sure that they get out to those particular markets, particularly with different government agencies, veteran agencies, veteran spouse agencies, that have their own portals, to make sure that we get our visibility into those portals.
And also he's in a position to look at your job descriptions and be able to understand whether or not they map to an MOS, a military occupational specialty, and be able to help you bridge those things. I think that's really just a wonderful benefit of having.
And that was one we were deliberate in making sure we brought on somebody who was military recruiting program manager, who was ex-military, who understands the language, has the connections, and he has other responsibilities like our skill bridge program and so forth, but certainly can talk that language. And then he's also created an ambassador program among our military associates, who also go out to job fairs and represent the company at these military job fairs, that can also not only represent Sonepar, but can also represent and talk the language and make the connection of military to military.
Got it. Dawn, does your organization also have a military veteran employee resource group? And if you do have an ERG like that, did they participate in your recruiting activities?
Yes, in fact, it's called Merge, military ERG.
Oh, that's great. I like that.
Yeah, it's called Merge. Yes, in fact, it is the military ERG that is actually helping us build out that we're calling military ambassador program. So it's in concert of what the ERG's objectives are, in addition to other objectives, but to help us with getting the word out that Sonepar is veterans friendly, and to be present in the local markets where we have offices and job availability, to be at those, whether it's base events, or the disability events, or any other kind of events.
That's great. And that's definitely something that I4CP has done a great deal of research on, is the benefits of employee resource groups, ERGs and BRGs, and not only the benefits of participating in them, and participating in them voluntarily as a leader. Some organizations have told us that that experiential learning, that experience is in some cases more effective than had they participated in a formal leadership development program that the company offers. But increasingly, the last 5 or more years, we've seen companies really actively engaging their ERGs and BRGs in their recruiting efforts, their strategies, their planning, all of that. And I think that's fantastic. Such a great resource that you have internally.
Yeah, our recruiting department's not very big, so we rely heavily on our 6 ERGs to be the recruiters in the marketplace. Everything from our African American to our Pride. So they are an extension of the recruiting department. Our role is to make sure that they're trained, and they have the information they need and the resources that they need to make sure that they're able to articulate the message, that the value proposition and the Sonepar message when they are out there recruiting. I mean, everything, even from teaching them how to interview, because interview on the spot, which is a skill
Right.
that not everyone has, because it's like, how do you get an interview by somebody who just passes you by in 5 minutes or less, right?
That's great. Love it. And then Kelly, I love your comment, having multiple perspectives to help review the job descriptions is such a good idea for diversity and inclusivity, especially. We definitely agree with that. We've actually created a whole series of bias audit checklists, and we created one for the talent acquisition function to really enable TA functions to take a step back and use it even as just a conversation starter, to go through that checklist and what are our job descriptions looking like? How are we talking about the organization to candidates that we're engaging with, and really being super aware of the messaging that we're putting out there. The bias auditing is a really important element of your job description renovation, if that's what you're doing. Okay, so how we do? Oh my gosh, we're out of time. Mimi, thank you so much for partnering with me, and Zeta as well. We want to remind everybody about the research that's ongoing right now. As I mentioned earlier, we just published our fantastic culture fitness study. We're going to have a webinar on the 16th for that. We are also in the process of about to launch a survey on productivity. Rebooting productivity, and what productivity is looking like and how it's being measured in organizations, specifically high performance organizations. We're also looking at leadership skills in this new era of work that we all find ourselves in later this year. We also want to remind everyone that our annual conference is coming up. It is next month in Scottsdale, Arizona. We have an absolutely stellar lineup of speakers, many of whom represent our global community of I4CP companies. If you haven't registered or you're interested in information, you can go to i4cp.com/conference to check it out. We would love to see you there. This year is going to be our biggest conference ever. I would say we are fully back from the pandemic, wouldn't you, Zeta, in terms of our conference participation?
Yes, I agree.
Absolutely. All right, so Mimi, Zeta, any final thoughts?
Just one for me, gratitude. So thank you for sharing, your thoughts and your time with us this morning. To everybody here, we're also a resource for everyone on this call. So please don't hesitate to reach out with questions.
Absolutely. I think actually our email addresses are on the last slide. Zeta, if you wanna share that, please feel free to reach out to myself, to Mimi, questions, comments, suggestions for future discussions that we will have around talent acquisition. And we hope that you come back again and again. We hope this was helpful for all of you. And again, thank you for your engagement. These conversations are really, really reliant on your energy and your input and the graciousness of your sharing with your peers. So thank you very much.